Youth workers, this is Dr. Kenda Creasy Dean. She's a professor at Princeton Seminary of Youth, Church, and Culture. And I'm Ann Bixler, one of her students, and I have the privilege of interviewing Kenda today to talk about Mennonite youth ministry. Kenda, I've come to realize how appreciative you are of Mennonites.
It's true, because all the Mennonite youth pastors I've ever met are really fun. So,
what is it that you see in the Mennonite tradition that is especially promising for youth ministry?
Yeah, I think there aren't very many other denominations that tempt me to leave my own, but there's something going on with the Mennonites that is very beguiling. And it's interesting that, we've talked about this, that at seminary, it's kind of a sport to complain about your denomination. And the only people who don't do that are the Mennonites. I understand that may not happen back at home.
Right.
That may be a different thing. But I do think, based on the exposure that I've had, which has been with extraordinary youth ministers who come from Mennonite churches, I think that there are probably two things that pop into my mind first. One is the extraordinary emphasis on community, and everything that's out there with secular and sacred youth work talks about the need for, above all else, young people yearn for this sense of community. So that is a huge gift. The other thing is, I think the prophetic tradition is part of who you are. And you do this in such a way that's so deeply tied to your particular heritage. You don't lose track of the faith roots of being prophetic. And what I'm trying to say is you don't slide easily into just political correctness, which is, I think, a tendency my denomination might have, because we are less informed, I think, about our own, spiritual heritage. But it seems to be very prominent in the upbringing in Mennonite communities that you talk about your heritage. It's something that you attempt to be closely related to, and so that's not very far removed from the prophetic voice that you have, which tethers it and allows you to have a prophetic voice in a culture without being subsumed by the culture. Now, I do know that that's the cultural. That defining yourself against culture is a practice that's got good and bad that goes with it. Right. I get that, right? But I also think it's a gift, right? It's something not to take lightly. Like anything else, you got to be responsible with it. But it's something that the rest of us learn from you guys. And could you just teach the rest of the world to sing? That would be so great. If we could all sing like Mennonites.
Singing.
I mean, yeah, right? From the time you're 3, I mean, everybody can do this, and it's it would improve the quality of church music exponentially, right? So, yeah.
Well, thanks, Kenda. Yeah, so community and a sense of a prophetic voice.
Yeah.
Is what I hear you saying, and is that you see that as being especially important for youth ministry?
I do. I mean, we know that what kids are, the sense of having a tribe, right, is critical when you're an adolescent. So to have a faith community that is explicit and forthright and really works hard at that, that is a huge plus. You can find downsides to everything, right? But on the whole, young people's need for community, I think, is an expression of their God-given humanity. And so when they find that, it rings true immediately. Sometimes they find it in unhealthy ways.
Right.
But to find it in the context of a community of grace, then, that really brings out, I think, a huge part of their just God-given nature. And so that's very acute during adolescence. So yeah, I think it's huge for youth ministry, and anyone who's ever read a youth ministry book knows that that's pretty much chapter 1.
Yeah, right.
Every time. The prophetic voice is also part of the adolescent experience in that, as you know, young people actually are wired in such a way, the way their brains are developing, the way they're developing socially, culturally, they are now glued together enough that they've got some distance, and so they're going to critique things anyway, right? And they're very quick to point out what's wrong with society and what's wrong with the church and what's wrong with everyone. But in the way that that is framed in a faith community, that's a spiritual practice, right? And so to be able to say, listen, part of what we do as people of faith is to name what has veered away from God's purpose for the world. And in naming that, we provide, a way back to who we were created to be, who God intends us to be as a society. So I do think those are both, deep core spiritual practices. And you guys do them really well.
Great. And what, on the other hand then, what are challenges that you would have? So you come from the United Methodist tradition. You're teaching at a school that's an institution of the Presbyterian Church, USA. So part of what I've appreciated as a student of yours and other teachers here is that I'm learning from other traditions and learning to see my own tradition through some new lenses. So you coming in with an outside perspective, what are some challenges, things for Mennonite youth workers to pay special attention to?
Well, I think we're all, our blessings are also our curses.
Yeah.
Right? As you know, with kids, and I use the word, teenagers call themselves kids, so I call them kids, but I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. They're tribal by nature, right? And that need for community, that need for significant others, that need for people to feel you, that's huge. And so there's a certain kind of, we call them cliques for a reason, right? They tend to be little closed circles that are hard to break into sometimes. And of course, churches have a way of doing that too. There are kind of two ugly ditches when it comes to Christian identity. One is to have, cheap grace that just lets anything and everything be okay. And the other is to have such high boundaries that there's no breaking in, and so I think there's a risk with anybody who has a strong identity of becoming insular, becoming withdrawn. And that's particularly true for theological traditions that have had, by virtue of your history, right? You've had to define yourself over and against the dominant culture. That's part of the way you learn how to see yourself as an Anabaptist, right? So that's a risk. I tend to come from the United Methodists, I would say, fall into the other side of the we fall into the cheap grace ugly ditch without any provocation whatsoever, and we often forget that there are identity boundaries that we need to help cultivate. And I don't think boundaries are walls. I think they're markers. And so we've confused those two things, I think, a lot. And so it's really evident, in all of the things that are happening in our culture right now. But boundaries are not something to be afraid of. They're something to cultivate and tend. A garden has an edge. Where the garden begins and where the lawn begins. The garden and the lawn are both very good things. They need each other. They cross-pollinate a lot. But it's good to know, where they are and where they begin and end. Anyway, so that's the risk of that. The prophetic voice, I think, is also, risk becoming untethered from our faith tradition and becoming just another way to, express our political or our social desires. And that's a very different thing than saying, well, wait a second, I'm trying to operate out of the way of Jesus here. And it may cause me to vote, for example, in a similar way to my neighbor who has no interest in Jesus whatsoever. But what matters is that the reason I'm doing it is not because of a civic responsibility, it's because of my faith
Yeah.
responsibility to be someone following in the way of Christ. So.
Yeah, so I hear that challenge, and the flip side of the benefit of the prophetic tradition is becoming insular and becoming disengaged, so disengaged that those boundaries become walls.
Well, and of course, every religious group we all have our variations on a theme, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I used to live, as you know, near Amish country.
Right.
And so old order Mennonites, boy, they got that identity thing and the boundaries down pat to the point where there is a very high, now there's a lot to admire about it, and there's a lot that feels very strange to me, as somebody who's not from that tradition. But one of the things that they do well, and they're taking it to an extreme in a way that most people would not do, is to say, we know who we are.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of that I want to learn from, very unlikely I'll be driving a horse and buggy anytime soon, but yeah.
This is as close as you come. This is me having
Mennonite friends, right?
Yeah.
Who teach me how to use the internet, it's great.
So moving on then from just things specific to the Mennonite tradition and its engagement of youth ministry, more generally speaking now in the youth ministry field, what shape do you see youth ministry taking as our cultural context changes, as the adolescent experience changes in every generation? What's sort of your hunch in the way
question, right?
youth ministry is going to change over the next generation?
Well, I think, boy, if we could answer that, it would solve a lot of problems, wouldn't it?
You seem to be a prophetic voice in youth ministry. That's why I thought maybe you would have some insight into this question.
Well, right, you study the things that you most need to learn. I think a couple things. I do think that we will need to make faith strange again. And what I mean by that is it's well documented now, and people talk about it a lot, but there's no question that what mostly happens in youth ministry is a form of acculturated Christianity.
Yeah.
And so, and part of that's because, we want to be a society that loves others and that is open to other perspectives and that respects each other's humanities, and all those things they look very similar to things that, you could imagine Jesus teaching. But there's a very fine line, but a clear line between compassion and just being nice, right? And so if most of youth ministry is about being nice, about knowing a few things about God, which is very different from knowing God, right? To be able to have the relational side of faith be something that's front and center. You would expect a Methodist to say stuff like that, I know, but I do think it's kind of a deal breaker. And people who do not have that have a very different way of approaching faith over and against culture. So, I don't know that culture and faith need to be starkly opposed, but they are distinct. And the way you engage culture, and I don't think that we run away from culture, but the way we engage culture is from a very different place, than from somebody who just kind of uncritically goes along with whatever they hear, on their phone or whatever is coming to them from social media or whatever else. So anyway, to make it strange, I think, means that, there are some things that Christians do that are kind of flat out weird. Praying, that probably goes down as one of the weirdest things religious people ever do. And, what is that about? There's some, practices like communion have long been considered very weird and a little scary.
Right.
That's fine. I think that's fine. We are invited to live in a way that is, not opposite of culture, but, at a different angle.
Yeah.
So we went to a backstage tour of Wicked
Yeah.
a few years ago, and I don't know if you've seen the show, but it, of course, it's kind of a prequel to The Wizard of
Right.
Oz, and so they were talking about the scenes in Oz, and they made sure that in those scenes, all of the costumes are asymmetrical,
Okay.
because they wanted Oz to be a little bit off. They wanted it to just register at some very subtle level that something is different here, and then, of course, it's green. But, I think that there's something a little asymmetrical about the way Christians are called to live. We live in the same way, we live in the same places, but we're a little odd. And I think it's worth reclaiming that. So one of the things that I think will help youth ministry to do is to, claim it from the beginning. And kids know better than parents do how much of a risk it is to live like a Christian in your school. And to be an out Christian. I mean, that is a scary thing to ask a kid to do. And we just do it really blithely. Well, of course, come on, you're part of the church. And they're like, they don't always articulate it, but they know this costs them to do that. And we need to recognize that, I think. So that's one thing. I also think that youth ministry will become less identified with youth groups and more identified with multiple forms of engagement. Some of them will be discipleship oriented. I hope we don't ever forget that.
Right.
But I think it's also true that the door into Christian community is likely to be, I heard somebody call it recently, a common cause. So as Christians work for the common good, other people join with that, not because they're testing out a church, but because they believe in the sanctity of whatever it is the church is working for. And through that doorway, more and more people will come to know the church, I think, in the future. That's true for young people too, and it may be that youth ministry, if our history is any indicator, youth ministry will likely lead the way in that. And what will happen is churches will say, oh my gosh, our youth ministry is falling apart because we don't have a youth group. Now the youth minister knows that, okay, we don't have a youth group, but we've got 5 kids over here, we got another 5 kids doing this, we got another 5 kids doing that. And all told, you've got way more young people involved than if everybody had to come to youth group. But that's, there will be a learning curve, I think, that goes with that.
So if we no longer need youth ministers to play the guitar and teach a Bible lesson,
well, I don't think that's a bad thing, right?
But the traditional stereotype of a youth pastor.
You don't have
what qualities will youth workers need for this changing approach to youth ministry that you envision?
Well, this will be the least surprising thing of this conversation, right? Because I think some theological depth is a good thing. I actually think, though, that the most important thing that any parent does or any youth leader does is they have to invest in their own faith. You can't give what you don't have. So, quality one is you're passionate about your relationship with God, and you cultivate it, and you question it, and you mess with it, you try to live with it. And out of that is the well that we draw from, right? In order to show others what a life of, faithfulness, attempts to look like. I think the qualities that youth ministers need, even though I do think a theological education is crazy important, those aren't the most important qualities. We will always need a sense of humor. We will always need some leadership agility. We've got to be able to lead in multiple ways with multiple kinds of people, not just young people, with parents too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other church leaders. Youth ministers are in middle management, which means one of the first skills you got to get good at is leading up.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you have to be able to lead from the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is you've got to educate some of your bosses, some of your people who have been in the church a lot longer than you,
Yeah.
and you've got to sort of bring them on board without, compromising your relationship with them.
Mhm.
At the same time, you've got to somehow, inspire, model, train leaders that are coming up behind you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean by the leadership agility. I think that's just generally something that we need to own as one of the things that successful youth pastors are really good at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all of the usual stuff
Mm-hmm.
you would expect. I think it matters that you can communicate,
Mm-hmm.
matters that you're organized, and that you can plan and not just do improvisational youth ministry. All of the things that have always been important
Yeah.
still matter, but those are the two things that I think
Mhm.
are probably going to lead with.
Yeah. Well, Kenda, thank you so much for taking time to respond to these questions and think with us about Mennonites and youth ministry.
You're still just super fun people to hang out with, so yeah, just about any excuse to
Great.
do that is good as far as I'm concerned. So
And every time you speak at one of our conferences or at our events, we feel the same way.
anyway, they
Thank you.
are lucky to have you coordinating stuff like this. So thanks.
Thanks,
Anyway.
Kenda.